Hello, sir.
In your novel, which is your latest work, The Book of Everlasting Things, the protagonist, Samir Vij, he's a perfumer and he collects smells, just like Firdaus collects calligraphy fonts. So, uh, olfactory memory, and are you equating that with somehow with tactile object memory of your earlier nonfiction work?
That's a great question. I'm really glad you picked up on that. Um, a lot of people, when I was interviewing them, spoke to me about smell. And like they remembered the smell of the soil in their garden in a particular village, or they remember the smell of their mother's sanduk, or they remembered the smell of the food she used to make. And smell is a very powerful portal as well. Our nose is such an extraordinary organ, and smell is our least understood and most fragile sense. During COVID, so many people couldn't smell. It really disarmed us. If we can't smell, we will not enjoy our life. We will not enjoy what we see, we will not enjoy what we eat. But of course, smell is a great way to remember people we love. You open an old perfume that your grandmother used to wear, and the minute you smell it, you'll remember her or your mother. You know, hair oil, Avla hair oil. It's such a prominent, poignant way to remember someone. So yes, absolutely, it was very conscious.
And
Yeah, calligraphy.
just before the interview began, I asked her, "Do you smell your books?"
Yes, yeah, I do. Of course, I do. And also, I write with fountain pen, so I smell my ink also. Yeah.
We are very honored and fortunate to have Aanchal Malhotra to talk about a book, Remnants of a Separation. And moderating this session will be Dr. Prantik Mukherjee. Banerjee, I'm so sorry. Dr. Prantik Banerjee. Coming from a long line of teachers, Prantik teaches contemporary English at Nagpur's Hislop College. Practicing an unconventional style of teaching, he encourages his students to break the rules to fall in love with language and literature, making his lectures extremely popular on campus. His father served in the IAF's education department, giving Prantik access to the best libraries very early in his life. And this, as he fondly recalls, opened the gates to Aladdin's cave for him, and thus began his love affair with books. A much sought after keynote speaker, Prantik is a curious traveler to places where he can find buried stories and forgotten histories. We are very thankful that Prantik is here to conduct the session. Uh, Talking about our author today, Aanchal Malhotra, is a writer and historian based in New Delhi. Intrigued by conversations around objects that her family had carried with them during the partition, Aanchal began collecting and archiving material memories treasured and preserved by displaced survivors of partition. Eventually, she compiled them into her debut book, Remnants of a Separation. Coming from a family of booksellers, books have been a constant in her life. As Achal herself says, I breathe words. Despite having been trained as an artist, words remain the best way I know how to express myself. We are fortunate to have Achal here to share her thoughts. And with a big round of applause, I would ask Pratik to please usher Achal onto the stage. Thank you. I would request you all to please either switch off your mobile phones or keep them on silent.
Good afternoon. The book that you see on the table is a book in conversation, but it's a rather, if you look carefully, it's already sort of yellowed and it's much dog-eared and thumbed book. So it's not usually the fresh from the oven kind of books that that authors are also accustomed to seeing when there is a conversation such as this. This is a book that Aanchal wrote in 2017, Feb, wasn't it? It was August. And I think I bought and read the book in September 2017, or no, even before that. And so this book is also, you could say, a remnants of a reading. Uh, because the book in conversation is remnants of a separation. I've been since 2017, ever since I read Aanchal Malhotra's this particular book, I have been stalking her writings. And we are very, very privileged to have you, right? Finally. And let's get straight to a lot of things that I have in mind. When you think of partition, it's even today, more than 70 years after the historical event happened, it's so very difficult even today to capture in words something that was inconceivable, something that was unimaginable, and something that became so much a part of the history of the subcontinent itself. And there is a whole lot of narrative that has already been written. Why narratives, not just in the written word, but also so much of partition narratives have been in cinema, particularly Hindi cinema, so many documentaries, so much of art installations as well. But your book, and when I read it, has such a unique and fascinating perspective it brings to partition. It's a book, if I may call it, an album of memories, isn't it? Or shall I say it's a kind of an album of bleeding histories and healing stories, if I may say so. What got you into writing a book on partition, moving your stories around objects, everyday things that people who caught themselves, who found themselves on the wrong side of the border, had to leave or had to take away, sometimes at the very last minute? How did you come upon this wonderful idea and ending and writing such a beautiful book?
Thank you for that very generous introduction, and thank you for spending your afternoon with me. Um, I guess the easy answer to why I started writing in the first place, and particularly a history that also involved my family, as four of my grandparents migrated from what is now Pakistan, is that I actually didn't know anything about that history. I was not like other people who grew up hearing stories about partition. You said this morning your grandfather told you once a little story, like a bedtime story almost. We didn't hear anything like that. And so there was such a vacuum about any kind of, ancestry, of course, but I didn't really realize that when my grandparents spoke about their home villages, those villages were now in Pakistan because they just sounded like rural places in India. So I, like many other people, learned about partition in history textbooks. And I was never really encouraged to ask more around the subject. Little did I know that my own family had so many stories to tell. In 2013, while I was a graduate student, I encountered two objects, two very, very mundane objects, which were a ghada, medium sized vessel in which lassi is made, and a guz, a yardstick used in a fabric shop, or a meter stick as we call it now. And these were the two things that my mother's family had carried from Lahore to Amritsar when they migrated. And they were such ordinary things that I'm sure I had seen them my whole life and never really paid any attention to them. But on that particular afternoon, my grandfather and his elder brother were talking about the objects in a way that I had never heard them talk about before. When they touched them, when they smelt them, when they spoke about them, they were transported across this very impenetrable border to what is now Pakistan, talking about how they spent their childhood in Lahore, the bicycles they used to ride, chilgoza they used to eat, and again, such very rural forms of happiness that don't necessarily conjure the images of partition that we understand and associate with the word today. And I obviously, that conversation obviously really changed me because I, for the first time, really understood the power that an object has to become a portal of history. An object can transport you somewhere. It can tell you a hidden story. It can connect generations to a time they have not seen. It can educate you. It is a very generous, democratic item that has no nationality or religion. So, an object is a very democratic medium, in fact. After that day, I couldn't stop thinking about objects. And I basically did a little experiment for myself with the people that my family knew in Delhi. And of course, at the time, I was much younger than I am even now. So imagine how a very young person can find very old people who have lived through partition and try to bridge not just generational gaps, but also gaps of religion, nationality, experience. And then the big question was, how do I ask questions about partition? What are the words that you use to speak about historical wounds, many of which have not been touched for decades? What is the vocabulary of loss? What is the vocabulary of migration? When I speak with my grandparents, can I call them refugees? Are they refugees? Decades have passed. Should I use the word Pakistan? Should I use the villages? Like these were the questions that were in my mind. And is language capable of holding such a tremendous weight of the past? Can words suffice? Also, I think it felt very intrusive to ask people things like, well, tell me about partition, how was it? It felt very direct, to too much. So, by using the aid of an object like the ghara or the guz, it felt like a gentler um, incision, right? To say, okay, well, okay, your mother carried this ring from Rawalpindi to Jalandhar. That's interesting. Why did she carry this ring? Okay, she thought she was going to sell it when she came. And who told her to carry something valuable? And when did you hear about this partition? Did you read about it? Did you hear about it on the radio? Oh, okay, you heard about it in school. What school did you go to? What language did you learn? What were you studying? So, the point, obviously, when talking about the object was to understand what they carried when they migrated, but it was also to paint an ethnographic picture of the life they had left behind and started afresh in either of the countries. So it was to create an ethnographic landscape of the past as well.
It's interesting because, I remember my maternal grandparents. They also could be called refugees because they came 1948, they crossed the border. And for a long time, in fact, as far as back I remember, there used to be a small trunk kept under the four-poster bed. And they never opened up in our family gatherings. People, they just wouldn't talk about it, nor would anybody ask them about it. It's almost as if partition, there was a kind of a collective conspiracy of silence that seemed to, wanting people to forget about something that was too traumatic, and maybe in the telling and the remembering of it, causing those wounds or those scars to come up again or open up again. So these objects that you say, I remember my maternal grandfather carrying a revenue stamp. He worked in the revenue department. So when one time, there was this one time when I opened the trunk and he found a rubber stamp and a revenue this thing. He said to me, it's not just about why I carried it. It's because everything that is in the revenue stamp is what I did in the last 34 years that I was in East Bengal, or East Pakistan rather. Objects are not just objects, isn't it? They're receptacles of memories, but also there's so much of emotion divested in them.
It's funny you say that line, objects are not just objects. I think objects are just objects until someone imbues them with memory. Because the bottle is just a bottle, a ring is just a ring, and then when you realize the history or the memory that is associated with it, the object comes to life. In its physicality, an object is just an object. It is large enough to hold a lot inside it.
But then in one of the interviews that you did, I think it's your maternal grandmother who carried um, a blade, a knife.
A knife,
A
yes.
knife.
Yes.
Tell us something about that.
So is my paternal grandmother. Yeah, she grew up in the northwest frontier province, and when not at partition, but a few years before that, also there were riots in her area, which was a predominantly Muslim area. So everyone in the house, particularly young girls, had been given this foldable knife, small foldable knife to keep on your person. and it was like हाथी दांत कहते हैं उसे, ivory basically, correct. तो वो छोटा सा knife था, and she would always keep it in her clothes, and because she always kept it in her clothes, it made its way to India, and she had all but forgotten about that object until we started speaking about that time, and then she remembered, oh, chacha, I have ये छोटी सी चीज़ मेरे पास है. So she gets out the knife and she shows me, and it's obviously not sharp at all. And she says, we were given this knife to protect ourselves when we were children, 15, 16 years old. And I said, well, what do you use the knife for now? And she said, well, when I go to the park, I cut aloe vera with it. So I think the object also, how it falls from grace, the utility of it, the context in which it is used, it's entirely based on your experiences. And I think this is why the object is a great tool to connect generations, because it can mean different things to different people, you know? Yeah.
Can I ask you to read a particular passage from your own book, of course, and then maybe we'll carry the conversation forward around that.
So I'm reading from the introduction, very short passage. The memory buried within things, sometimes greater than what we are able to recollect as the years pass. Memory dilutes, but the object remains unaltered. It allows one to study the history within it and for generations to live off that history and perhaps understand genealogy better. What one carried across the border, how many, and what kind of objects they brought, how they were able to carry them across, what was valuable and what mundane, was often determined by the kind of life one had led, and provides incredible understanding into the material culture of that time.
So, like one of the interviews who said when she talked about a necklace of pearls, isn't it? And she brought a black cloth bag to you, and then she said, you asked, "Isme kya hai?" What she said is pretty revealing. She said, "Isme bachpan hai mera." And therefore, I said, objects are not just objects. There's so much of the history, and not just personal history, the history of a mohalla, the history of a gully, the history of having food together, irrespective of one's religious faith or whatever you call it. So, one, like you said, memory dilutes, fades, mutates, alters. Also, the emotions that we attach to objects also change, isn't it, over a period of time? Especially you third generation, isn't it? So am I. So when third generation, when we for example still remember, and very few of us, unlike you, don't turn it into books. Thank you for writing that book. Those same objects no longer mean the same, do they? They change their, not just the historical meaning that we attach to it, but what it means, for example, because many a times we think this is just raddi. Especially during spring cleaning, you say that, this old trunk, this old piece of iron, or these old books, or maybe some postcards, for instance. Postcards, right? How did that come across when you visited houses where there were three generations, right? And the younger generations not knowing about what their grandparents had gone through?
Yeah, that's such a great question, because multi generational conversations are really revealing, because they show us how every generation interacts with the past.
Can I just add a rider to that? Maybe you can continue to answer that. Is trauma also passed on from one generation to the next?
So it's a great addendum. uh, Not always, in my opinion. And that's why I'm very particular about using the term intergenerational trauma, because not everyone may feel that, or trauma may not look the same for everyone as well. I've spent a long time thinking about what is passed down with partition. Silence, of course, often being the strongest language that's passed down and practiced by many people. Um, let's take an example of a sword. You have the original edition of this book. 2 years after, or 1 year after this edition was published, another edition was published with 2 additional chapters. One of those chapters was about a sword. And
This is not in this book.
no, it's in the paperback though. So a gentleman from Chandigarh wrote to me and he said, "Oh, I see you've published this book. My grandmother has a sword that she carried from Mirpur. Mirpur is now in Pakistan. Would you like to come and see that sword? I don't know much about it, but she'll be able to tell you." I said, "Yes, of course." So I make my way from Delhi to Delhi to Chandigarh to see this sword from Mirpur. And we're sitting with it, and the man, he's actually turns out to be a young boy, much younger than I am, Gushen. And Gushen tells me this is the sword and this is my grandmother, and we're talking, and then all of a sudden, she starts to tell the story of why the sword was carried. And so she says that, partition had happened. We were living in Kashmir at the time. And Kashmir, as Kashmiris, they were state subjects, so they were kind of safe at the time of August 47. Then October came around, and that's really when the riots started in their area. So they had to migrate very quickly. They came to Jammu by foot. They walked for 3 days. She says that my husband was in the Rawalpindi Air Service at Chaklala Airfield, and so for his protection from the army, he had been given a sword. This very sword that she had. The sword said R Pindi on it. Rawalpindi. Gushen and I are sitting, and Gushen has never seen this, even though the sword has been in his house forever. So this is an aspect that is revealed to him through the conversation, and he's, sitting with a little magnifying glass and saying, "Oh, this is so interesting. Okay, fine." We're sitting, and then she starts to tell the story of their migration to India. The riots in their area were so awful that she remembers watching her father being murdered, her uncle being murdered, her mother, grandmother, and two siblings being carried off to later what they learn is the Ali Beg concentration camp. And she and her husband manage to escape somehow, and they walk. They walk for 3 days, and she is pregnant. This lady is pregnant, and she's walking, and as luck would have it, she is going to give birth at any minute. And she says to me, "The only thing my husband carried is this sword for our protection, and maybe just a few, like little bit of money. I think it was like 30 rupees or something like that in his pocket, not nearly enough for anything significant." So they're walking, and she says to him, "I'm very tired. You go on without me." And as they are walking, the dire situation of people who are walking with them, who have young children, the way she describes how people place their children down on the ground and put large stones on their chest so that the child could not move because they could not carry them physically. And of course, this woman is pregnant, and she's thinking in her head about, "God, what if I have this child here?" On the third day, that's exactly what happens. She cannot move any longer, and she tells her husband that, "I will be giving birth here. I don't know what to do." So she sits. These women who are also walking in the kafila with them, they help her, and she gives birth, and they need to cut the umbilical cord, and they use the sword, the R Pindi sword. And so the child is born, and the child is healthy. And then the couple is thinking, "We don't have enough energy to continue. Can we take this child with us? Should we leave this child behind?" So they leave the child behind, and they start to walk, and they've barely gone 5 paces, and the child starts crying, and they can't take it, and they come back and they pick her up, and she's very much alive still. But this sword, then, Gushen is sitting with me. Gushen is much younger than me. His mother is sitting, his father is sitting, grandmother is telling the story. Gushen has never heard these details before. And his mother, his father, they're saying, child that was born, her name was Malkeet. So they're like, "Malkeet didi to kahani batao na, unko kya hua tha, ye hua tha." So they are also prompting because they've heard different parts of the story. Gushen, of course, has never heard it, so he's kind of in awe and shock and surprise and confusion and disbelief as to how they've survived. And then what happens to an object of trauma? Of course, there is intergenerational trauma which looks different for these three generations, but what happens to the object of trauma? For Gushain, it is an object of the past. It obviously now holds immense importance after the story he's heard. For the lady's husband, it was the only object he had from his hometown of Rawalpindi, so he never wanted to throw it. For the woman herself, it is a really awful reminder of what she lived through. And she didn't want it. She said every year when we used to clean the house, I used to tell him, get rid of this thing. But he kept it. The object is just a sword. It has so many different meanings, though, based on what experiences people have had with them. And it becomes such a complicated form of memorabilia in a way because it is also married with this kind of national history, personal history, traumatic history, history of migration, history of citizenship, and it can also potentially just be a decorative thing in your house. So an object is very revealing. Should you give it that opportunity?
I think it'll take more than a minute for what you just said to sink in. In the stories that you have recounted in the book, objects, people migrate, people cross borders, stories migrate, stories cross borders. But objects also have they also cross borders multiple times. I want you to tell us about that Toronto, the silverware that comes on the dining table all the way in Toronto.
Such strange things. Interviewed a gentleman in Delhi and about the things that his family had carried from Rawalpindi again. His ancestor's name was Arjan Singh Bedi. And he told me the story of these silver glasses, चांदी के ग्लास. उस ज़माने में जब हमारे like weddings वगैरह होते थे, if any of you have old utensils, they usually have people's initials, tuck, 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 exactly, dot, dot, dot वाला, dotted. हाँ, because they didn't have engraving tools, so little like इनिशियल्स होते थे. वाई? बिकॉज किसी घर में शादी होती थी, इतने बर्तन किसी के पास थे नहीं. अच्छा, यहाँ से 5 ले लो, वहाँ से 5 ले लो, यहाँ से 6 ले लो, देन यू रिटर्न देम आफ्टर योर इवेंट इज डन. So this gentleman's family migrated from Rawalpindi to Delhi. They couldn't carry everything. And when I'm interviewing this gentleman, he says that, we left a lot of wealth in that house, including these glasses, these silver glasses with my ancestor grandfather's name, Arjan Singh Bedi. Then, many years later, a family friend of mine was in Canada and he met a Pakistani family and went to dinner at their house. He was invited to dinner, went to dinner. On the table, there were glasses engraved with Arjan Singh Bedi. Imagine. Imagine. So he says, how objects travel and, like you say, multiple trips.
Memories also are different, aren't they? I mean, there are what you call family histories or family memories. And there are history memories. What we read in textbooks or what we read in official narratives is another kind of memory. How did you reconcile between, let's say, when you think of history, you think of facticity, you think about objectivity, you think of something that is given in a very chronological, linear order. And you think of memory being something very subjective, intimate, personal. How does, you are an archivist of memories, a keeper of memories. In your book, how do you did you feel the need to reconcile between the facticity of the stories and maybe memory which is not always so reliable, isn't it?
Great question, often asked. I always call myself an oral historian because there is a distinction between archival historians or very traditional historians and oral historians. Unfortunately, oral history is very low in the hierarchy of, let's say, history keeping. But it's just your grandmother's memory. It's just your mother's, just your uncle. How can you trust? How can you trust memory? How can you prove memory? And at the beginning of my career, 10 years ago, I was very interested in this question, in answering this question, in defending the perspective of my methodology of oral history, because people asked about it so much. Now, actually, I'm not so concerned with it because we only trust the written archive because Western notions have told us that a written archive is the truth. But it's just one version. उसको भी तो किसी ने लिखा है, अपने पर्सपेक्टिव से लिखा है या अपने विक्टर के पर्सपेक्टिव से लिखा है. So then your grandmother and your uncle and this auntie on the street that are telling you equally significant things about that part of the past should also be considered the truth. These archival history and oral history must go together because history cannot be written without people. It is the story of people. But I know that my methodology of oral history comes with its own drawbacks. This question of veracity will always be asked. And there are ways to curb it. There are ways you can find what people are saying in a written archive and say, yes, this actually happened. Or you can do multiple interviews from the same area to see whether the chronology of things that they are saying makes sense. Or the story that I told you when we were sitting down. There's a chapter in this book where a gentleman is, when I was speaking to him in Pakistan, he told me about how when he was a 16-year-old boy during partition, he was in Aligarh. And at the time, there were a lot of riots in Aligarh, and a Muslim woman, Begum Abad, and her family, who lived in a house called Neeli Chhatri, took in a lot of these young families to save them. And he said, I remember this woman, she was incredibly strong, she was so just. And I put that into my book. I didn't think much of it. Last week, a lady wrote me an email and said, I'm from Bhopal and I was reading your book on a plane and I was reading this chapter and about Begum Abad. And I want to tell you, Begum Abad is my grandmother. And she lived in a house in Aligarh called Neeli Chhatri, and she saved a lot of families during partition. Now, this means that what he said was the truth. There is veracity there. People's memories are reliable. Yes, they may extend and they may exaggerate certain things, but essentially they remember what they remember because it's meaningful to them. And it should be meaningful to us. Oral history is a vast field which allows, the greatest gift, like really the greatest benefit of oral history is its diversity. That it allows various perspectives of a single event to coexist. It allows people to speak for themselves in their native language with their emotions. It is not judgmental. There is space. There is dignity. And I think this is why I always call myself an oral historian. I do, earlier somebody was also talking about Indra Chaudhary, who is also an oral historian based in Bangalore. She writes on partition as well. And of course, the first histories of partition were people stories or fiction. The two ways that we learnt about partition was either through novels, Tamas, Garam Hawa, Train to Pakistan, yes, absolutely. Or people's stories in the 80s and 90s with Urvashi Butalia, Ritu Menon, Kamla Basin recording women's stories.
So, what happens to those stories once those who were witness? Now it's been more than 70 years. Clearly, there are, I think, the last of the witnesses, what we call testimonial narratives, isn't it? These stories are now going to be passed on, if at all they will, and they're going to pass on as second hand. So, what happens when people who witness something as traumatic as partition, when they pass away and no more remain? What happens to those stories then?
Depends on your family. In my opinion, any historical event, when viewed through the prism of memory, will offer infinite possibilities to look at it, which is the only reason why 65 years after partition, I could produce a book that was different than any that had been written before. Already, it is so difficult to give importance to eyewitness accounts. that it is even harder, it has been harder to rely on second hand memory, because the question is right, can these things be felt in second handedness? Is there second hand fear? Is there second hand hope? Is there second hand anger? Is there second hand bitterness? Second hand love? Can they be felt? These were the questions that I was also asking myself, because a lot of people my age, or maybe your age or younger than us, were trying to make associations with their ancestors' experience of partition, but not knowing whether they had the right to talk about it as their own because they had not witnessed it firsthand. But second-hand memory is a very important resource.
Think about the entire body of Holocaust literature, for
Correct.
instance,
Exactly.
isn't it? Yeah.
Exactly. So I spent 9 years thinking about this subject, recording second-hand memories, and that was my second book. This 700-page tome about younger people trying to answer a very simple question: is partition relevant? Should we be speaking about it? Does it mean different things to different people? And obviously, the answers are as varied as the questions. Survivors feel similarly as descendants feel, I think. Yes, the descendant may be further away from the point of memory, but I don't think the feeling should be questioned, because they can feel as strongly or as weakly as their experience has been interacting with the subject, you know.
I think last year, your grandfather's bookshop, Bari Sons in Delhi, completed 70 years, isn't it? Yeah.
It's a very big deal.
And I'm so sorry, I kept the book there. It's there in my laptop bag. A bookshop also is a part of material history, isn't it? Especially those who came across the borders and opened bookshops.
And he opened a shop in a refugee market.
Yeah, in a refugee market. Yeah. And so the legacy of partition continues in it continues in many forms, in many shapes, isn't it? As a you know, it's kind of difficult, isn't it, to keep this entire discourse on partition on an even keel ground, because there seem to be so many narratives that often conflict, narratives that all seem to almost cancel each other, and yet it seems as if partition, there is still a lot more to understand and know about partition, and therefore the need therefore the need for books such as yours, isn't it? During the course of your research, and you spent considerable time, nearly 7 years, as you were saying, just the enormity of what you were doing, did it personally affect you? I'm sure it did, right?
Of course.
And
I would be like a robot if it didn't. I think even just hearing any story, like obviously the one that I told about the sword is a very extreme kind of story, just infused with violence. But even stories that didn't have that, it really changes you on a number of levels. I think, firstly, the privilege of being able to listen to someone else's story, and to be and for someone to trust you to tell it. And often these are people that may not have talked about partition ever in their lives. And here is a researcher asking them about it, and because I've asked about it, they have told me. So I have a moral responsibility to tell that story without bias.
but those stories resonate to even present day times, because I
Yes,
remember
absolutely.
in preparing for this conversation, I called up my mama. Right, he's in his late 80s, and I said, when you crossed, when grandfather crossed the borders, uh, do you still carry the refugee certificate? I mean, refugees were given a certificate, and the whole question of citizenship or citizenry, which is so much on the boil today, is connected to partition histories.
100%. It Where are your papers? Or yes, and more so on the eastern side, you see, of course, it's a very topical conversation even today. The difference between Koti and Bengal is contested. It's a huge topic of conversation, who is really from here, you know. I think these things come up very often, and they came up. Now it's interesting you're bringing this up. With the CA NRC conversation, it came up in people's homes again and again, and the only kind of parameter they had to gauge was partition. Partition became precedent.
And sometimes it split families also, isn't it?
Correct.
The
Absolutely.
the mother having the documents and the father does not having
That's
that.
also what happened at partition, right? Families were divided quite ruthlessly because of this. But yes, there is also, I find sometimes the fear continues on. A lot of, when I was doing interviews for this second Descendant book, one of the things that came up really often that I found very strange was the number of people that said, my grandmother always keeps food by her bedside. Or I don't know why, but they always have a bag packed. Or after my grandparents passed away, under their pillows I found knives. So obviously the fear of being dislocated from what your home is, displaced, can reverberate across decades, even when you have a safe life. For my grandfather, maybe it wasn't as like food or weapons, but it was money for him. No matter how much money he had made later in his life, he was incredibly frugal. He would never spend on anything he didn't need to spend on because he remembered what it felt like to not have anything, you know.
All your three books are about partition, although between the after the writing of the second one, which is the language of remembering, you migrated to fiction. What made
Just
you do that?
temporarily.
So how did that happen?
Um, I think when you're recording real people's stories, you're very aware that it's a story you can't change. You don't have any agency to move its details around. You have to tell the story in the manner that was told to you, even if you may not agree with that perspective. The point is that the ethics of storytelling must be true. So when you have recorded X number of stories, something in you, I think, says that maybe what if I try a little bit of flexibility with things? And when you accumulate, let's say, a decade of landscapes, I think I had an idea in my mind that could only work as fiction because it started at the time of the First World War and it used partition as a center point and then ended in present day. So it's a story that spans a century, and the only way it could have worked is if I wrote it as a novel, because otherwise it would be three or four different nonfiction books. But also, fiction gives you the elasticity. Um, I read somewhere that Hilary Mantel said something like, I wanted to see whether fiction was flexible enough to include history in it. Hmm? Well, I wanted to see if history was flexible enough to include fictitious characters in it and whether those characters would be absorbed by the historical landscape. So, obviously, when you're trained as a historian, there are things that are quite frustrating about writing fiction.
Yet you choose to, your novel is titled from one of the chapters of this book,
I'm so glad you picked
The
up
House
on that.
of Everlasting Memories.
Yes, the Book of Everlasting Things. Absolutely, absolutely. There is a lot of intertextuality in all of my work. You can read each of the stories separately. You can read the books together. The only thing I like the ideal reader to do is read slowly, because as we were talking earlier and you said it will take some time. It does take time because you are supposed to reflect on what has happened in the past and see what you can take from it, because these are real people's real stories and they mean something.
Last question.
Yes.
On a personal note, what does Aanchal Malhotra do when she is not researching and writing about partition?
Either reading or sleeping, to be very honest. I really value sleep a lot. I don't get enough of it. I write from 10 p.m. to 3 a.m. and it's really exhausting. So when I'm not writing or when I'm not promoting the books, I really value my sleep. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's been. I'm done, or rather, I'm not done, but I have to, open the floor to, I'm sure, plenty of questions. I mean, look at the number of hands that are already raised. Yeah, please.
And I've got the mic first. Lucky me. Anchal, I wanted to ask you, when we are doing your research and interviewing the people, the primary research, did you ever feel then or later on that there was post-traumatic stress disorder, because a lot of people, and I'm just going to take 1 second. My father also had the same reaction. Never wants to talk about it. Never wants to see anything. If you see something on TV, they'll switch the channel. So this is classic post-traumatic stress disorder.
One version of it. There are many ways that people deflect, but yes, absolutely. Insistence on not talking about
Yeah.
it, agreeing to talk about it, but then when I arrive saying आज मन नहीं है बात करने का. When you get to the moment of violence, saying as Azra Haq did, oh, would you rather I don't describe it? You can imagine what I mean, right? Yes, and I think there are so many reasons for why people do this. I asked my grandmother once that when you were staying in the camp, she stayed in Kingsway camp for nearly a decade. I asked her, right after partition, if there was someone like me, an oral historian or like a journalist who went around and kind of recorded what had happened, would you have wanted to speak to them? And she said no. Immediately she said no. She said because, and it's interesting because she was speaking about the present, but she was using that past as an example. And she said, well, you come and you ask your questions and we talk and then you leave and then I go back to that time.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm still in that time. And this is really the dilemma that people like me have to live with on an everyday basis. When we ask the question, are we causing more harm than good? Yes, it's very important to create an oral archive of what people lived through so we can understand what the time was like. But what are the ways to do it ethically and to do it kindly?
Yeah.
Right? I think about this a lot.
Also, your grandmother once saying, ask me quickly before I forget.
Which also tells you that people, it's very complicated. They could want to remember but not want to say. Sometimes saying I don't remember can also mean I don't want to remember. It's very, very complex. Yeah. Hi.
Hi Achal. First of all, congratulations for Bahari Sons turning 70.
Thank you so much.
It is a great reassurance for readers like us. And when I read Remnants of a Separation, the introduction itself runs into 35 pages. And
Sorry about that.
No. The effect it had on me was I was so overwhelmed that I could not get back to reading it for the next 3 days. It took me 3 days to process what I had read. So my question to you is from the point of a writer. How did you process this grief? Because for you to write it down, you must have visited and revisited those memories time and again. So how did you process this grief and put it down so beautifully the way you did?
Yeah, that kind of ties into your question that sorry I didn't answer properly. The easy way, I guess the easy answer is to say that I have not really processed it. The ideal thing should have been for me to take some kind of therapy to understand what happens when you are a vessel of other people's sadness. But I didn't do that either. I think it only dawned on me 5 years into recording interviews that I had changed as a person. And the signs for me were the fact that I had become very inward, very reticent. I was not interested in small talk, and just an overwhelming feeling of heaviness, which I think I still have. Like, I'm not a light person. I'm not like a masti marne wala person. That's just not going to be me. But I think that you have to bring a kind of seriousness to your personality if you're going to do justice to the things that people have said to you, particularly if they are much older. You have to very quickly cross that age divide between you and them, which is often decades. So I am still very much processing it. I think about it often. There are things I recorded in 2013 that I wrote only about in 2022 because it takes a bit of time to think about what it means. Also, when you're a very young person in your early 20s, you're very quick to judge. And maybe later you realize that there was this that I could have written differently. And personally, I am taking a break from partition literature now to write something else, but I will return to it again in the future.
I very much identify with you and with your doctor as well. So there are so many things in my mind, but I'll come back only to one question. My question to you is: suppose let's take one story. You ask one story from one particular person. Let's talk about the Rawalpindi sword. Do you think, had you asked the same lady again the same question, there would have been some twist?
Great question. I have a perfect example for you. One of the ways to corroborate whether people are telling the truth is to answer the same question, ask the same question to the same person again and again and again over a set period of time, say a few months. Um, I interviewed a lady, Prabjot Kaur, who is a very well known Punjabi poet. Thankfully, I had the chance to speak to her. I think her work should be read more. The first time I spoke to her, she told me about how her family had migrated from Lahore to Kalyan here in Maharashtra by train. And she said, no, that's all she said the first time. Okay, we migrated by train. Her daughter was there. Her daughter was there the second time I went also. I wanted to clarify certain things. And this time, several months had passed. Obviously, she had been thinking about it. So several months had passed, and then when she got, I said, "Can you please confirm that you went from Lahore to Kalyan by train on this day, flana, flana, whatever?" And then she says, "Yes, मुझे याद है गाड़ी आई सी और वो कट कट के आई सी और हम लोगों के ऊपर बैठ के गए थे हिंदुस्तान." So they had sat on the dead bodies, and then she described the way in which, no, she's a poet, right? So she remembers all the details. She says that मुझे याद सी कि कुर्ते में खून का स्टेन लगा, किसी के ऊपर बैठी हुई थी, उनके ब्लड का स्टेन लगा, एंड शी डिस्क्राइब द कलर एंड द शेप ऑफ दैट, कि इतना डार्क था कि बड़ी देर ना मैंने धोया उसको, वो गया नहीं. एंड हर डॉटर हु इज सिटिंग देयर, शी सेज कि मम्मी तुमने कभी बताया नहीं कि ये हुआ था, अभी कैसे याद हुआ? आर यू श्योर यू आर टेलिंग द ट्रूथ? Are you sure? Because are you sure you're not confused with something? You know, why didn't you ever tell me this before? And Prabjot Kaur says there was never any need to tell you this before. So does memory emerge when it needs to emerge? Is there so much more that we don't know? Do people conceal on purpose because they can't say what they remember? Like, I can't get over the fact that she remembered the stain, you know? So yeah, I have interviewed people about the same thing over a number of months. Sometimes they have added more things. There has never been a time when they have really deviated from what they've said, but that is one of the ways in oral history that you can corroborate the story. You can ask me the question later. Yeah.
Can we, yeah, there are, maybe we can carry
Thank you
that
for sharing
conversation
that.
a little later. There are.
Aanchal, this beautifully written book, there are most of the stories are written by the people, migrants from the Punjab and the Muslims, except that Hamam Dasta of Savitri Mir Chandani and the certification of Sushil Chandra Sanyal. I have a curiosity that people, migrants from the Sindh and Gujarat, did they not suffer this?
It's a great question.
Because
Yes.
there are very few stories, means I have not read, except in your book of Savitri Mir Chandani.
In fact,
Thank you.
even after I put remnants together, that was one of the things that I thought lacked in the text, that there were not enough stories from different parts. Yes, of course, Sindh and Gujarat, but also Bengal has so many different, and the migrations in Bengal can be traced all the way up to 93.
Three partitions.
And yes, of course, and the border was so porous, like up until 93, people were migrating. So, not only that, there's stories from Hyderabad, stories from Kerala, stories from Kashmir, UP, Bihar that I didn't think I had enough of. So, I rectified that in my second book, and this is it's very big, it's like 700 pages, but it has a lot more geography and diversity of people, and of course, different classes as well.
Hi, Aanchal.
Hello, sir.
In your novel, which is your latest work, The Book of Everlasting Things, the protagonist, Samir Vij, he's a perfumer and he collects smells, just like Firdaus collects calligraphy fonts. So, olfactory memory, and are you equating that with somehow with tactile object memory of your earlier non-fiction work?
That's a great question. I'm really glad you picked up on that. Um, a lot of people, when I was interviewing them, spoke to me about smell. And like they remembered the smell of the soil in their garden in a particular village, or they remember the smell of their mother's sanduk, or they remembered the smell of the food she used to make. And smell is a very powerful portal as well. Our nose is such an extraordinary organ, and smell is our least understood and most fragile sense. During COVID, so many people couldn't smell. It really disarmed us. If we can't smell, we will not enjoy our life. We will not enjoy what we see, we will not enjoy what we eat. But of course, smell is a great way to remember people we love. You open an old perfume that your grandmother used to wear, and the minute you smell it, you'll remember her or your mother. You know, hair oil, Avla hair oil. It's such a prominent, poignant way to remember someone. So yes, absolutely, it was very conscious.
And just
Yeah.
before the
Calorie.
just before the interview began, I asked her, "Do you smell your books?"
Yes, yeah, I do. Of course, I do. And also, I write with the fountain pen, so I smell my ink also. Yeah, yeah.
Excuse me, ma'am, but what part would you assign to imagination in this collective biography, which in essence is what history is all about? And on a personal note, how much did imagination figure in your personal writing? And wouldn't you use that as an evidence of journalism being elevated into art?
Three very distinct questions. Imagination is a word that I fear, personally.
Okay.
I don't think I am very imaginative because I depend so much on the oral testimony that I have received, which I cannot ignore, may be partly imagined. Right? So, what people are remembering has settled into their memory over many years. Collective memory can become personal memory can become collective memory, it can be influenced by film, it can be influenced by books, and all of this together collectively makes the memory that someone is telling you. Imagination plays a part in that. I have accepted that. Do I think I'm a very imaginative person? No. And I found well, I mean it right, no, it when I was writing my novel, I found myself grappling with this because to write fiction, you have to be imaginative. To imagine potential histories, you have to be imaginative. And I did find myself struggling a little bit, but it is the kind of struggle that makes you a better writer. That sort of extends your own brain a little bit, stretches it from ways you didn't know it needed to be stretched, to conceive of possible landscapes. So I have learned to embrace imagination in fiction, not yet in my non-fiction, but perhaps in the future.
Too much of history is injurious to health.
You think so? Well, thank you for the question. It's really interesting.
Does anybody else have a question?
It's very true. Yes.
So I think questions are over.
Thank you so much, Aanchal Malhotra, for such an engaging and engrossing. Thank you, audience. Thank you, audience, also for making the conversation such a lovely samvad. Thank you so much.
And I also think we need to be indebted to people like Aanchal for giving oral history a place that it deserves. And as she rightly said, the dignity that those stories deserve. Thank you so much, Aanchal. Thank you. It's created by Mandira, especially for VLF. Thank you so much for being part of it. There's also this envelope, token of appreciation for Dr. Prantik Banerjee for doing a wonderful session. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.